Continuing, come in and sit back. We continue with our reading of At the Mountains of Madness. So, part 2. That's not an official part, but anyway, it is a fact that the wind had wrought dreadful havoc. Whether all could have lived through it, even without the other thing, is gravely open to doubt. The storm, with its fury of madly driven ice particles, must have beyond anything our expedition had encountered before. One aeroplane shelter, after all, had been left in far too flimsy and inadequate state, was nearly pulverized, and the derrick at the distant bourne was entirely shaken to pieces. The exposed metal of the grounded planes and drilling machinery was bruised into a high polish, and two of the small tents were flattened despite their snow banking. Wooden surfaces left out in the blast were pitted and denuded of paint, and all signs of tracks in the snow were completely obliterated. It is also true that we found none of the arcane and biological objects in a condition to take outside as a whole. We did gather some minerals from a vast tumbled pile, including several of the greenish soapstone fragments, whose odd five-pointed rounding and faint patterns of grouped dots caused so many doubtful comparisons, and some fossil bones, among which were the most typical of the curiously injured specimens. None of the dogs survived. Their hurriedly built snow enclosure near the camp had been wholly destroyed. The wind may have done that, though the greater breakage on the side next to the camp, which was not the windward one, suggested an outward leap or break of the frantic beasts themselves. All three sledges were gone, and we have tried to explain that the wind may have blown them off into the unknown. The drill and the ice-melting machinery at the boring were too badly damaged to warrant salvage, so we used them to choke up that subtly disturbing gateway to the past which Lake had blasted. We likewise left at the camp the two most shaken up of the planes, since our surviving party had only 4 real pirates: Sherman, Danforth, McTee, and Ropes, in all, with Danforth in a poor nervous shape to navigate. We brought back all the books, scientific equipment, and other incidentals we could find, though much was rather unaccountably blown away. Spare tents and furs were either missing or badly out of condition. It was approximately 4 p.m. after wide-plane cruising had forced us to give Gedney up for lost. We sent our guarded message to the Arkham for relaying, and I think we did well to keep it as calm and uncommittal as we succeeded in doing. The most we said about agitation concerned our dogs, whose frantic uneasiness near the biological specimens was to be expected from poor Lake's accounts. We did not mention, I think, their display of the same uneasiness when sniffing around the queer greenish soapstones and certain other objects in the disordered region, objects including scientific instruments, airplanes, and machinery, both at the camp and at the boring, whose parts had been loosened, moved, or otherwise tampered with by winds that must have harbored singular curiosity and investigativeness. About the 14 biological specimens, we were pardonably indefinite. We said that the only ones we discovered were damaged, but that was enough to let them at least to prove Lake's description wholly and impressively accurate. It was hard work keeping our personal emotions out of this matter, and we did not mention numbers or say exactly how we had found those which we did find. We had by that time agreed not to transmit anything suggested madness on the part of Lake's men, and it surely looked like madness to find 6 imperfect monstrosities carefully buried upright in 9-foot snow graves under 5 pointed mounds, punched over with groups of dot in patterns exactly like those on the queer greenish soapstones dug up from Mesozoic or Tertiary times. The 8 perfect specimens mentioned by Lake seemed to have been completely blown away. We were careful, too, about the public's general peace of mind. Hence Danforth and I said little about that frightful trip over the mountains the next day. It was the fact that only a radically lightened plane could possibly cross a ridge of such height, which mercifully limited that scouting tour to the two of us. On a return at 1 a.m., Danforth was close to hysterics, but kept an admirably stiff upper lip. It took no persuasion to make him promise not to show our sketches and other things we brought away in our pockets, not to say anything more to the others than what we had agreed to relay outside, and to hide our camera films for private development later on. so that part of my present story will be as new to Paybody, McTee, Rope, Sherman, and the rest as it will be to that world in general. Indeed, Danforth is closer mouthed than I, for he saw or thinks he saw one thing he will not even tell me. As all know, our report included a tale of a hard ascent, a confirmation of Lake's opinion that the great peaks are of Achaean slate, and other very primal crumpled strata unchanged since at least middle Comanchean time, a conventional comment on the regularity of the clinging cube and rampart formations, a decision that the cave mouths indicate dissolved calcareous veins, a conjecture that certain slopes and passes would permit of the scaling and crossing of the entire range by seasoned mountaineers, and a remark that the mysterious other side holds a lofty and immense super plateau as ancient and unchanging as the mountains themselves. 20,000 feet in elevation, the grotesque rock formation protruding through a thin glacial layer, and with low, gradual foothills between the general plateau surface and the sheer precipices of the highest peaks. This body of data is in every respect true so far as it goes, and it completely satisfied the men at the camp. We laid our absence of 16 hours, a longer time than our announced flying, landing, reconnoitering, and rock collecting program called for, to a long mythical spell of adverse wind conditions, and told truly of our landing on the farther foothills. Fortunately, our tales sounded realistic and prosaic enough not to tempt any of the others into emulating our flight. Had any tried to do that, I would have used every ounce of my persuasion to stop them, and I do not know what Danforth would have done. While we were gone, Peabody, Sherman, Ropes, McTighe, and Williamson had worked like beavers over Lake's two best planes, fitting them again for use, despite the altogether unaccountable juggling of their operative mechanism. We decided to load all the planes the next morning and start back for our old base as soon as possible, even though indirect that was the safest way to work toward McMurdo Sound. For a straight-line flight across the mostly ultra-known stretches of the Aeon-dead continent would involve many additional hazards. Okay, so I was adjusting sound. Okay, we're good now. Further exploration was hardly feasible in view of our tragic decimation and the ruin of our drilling machinery. The doubts and horrors around us, which we did not reveal, made us wish only to escape from the austral world of desolation and brooding madness as swiftly as we could. As the public knows, our return to the world was accomplished without further disasters. All planes reached the old base on the evening of the next day, January 27th, after a swift non-stop flight, and on the 28th we made McMurdo Sound in 2 laps, the one pause being very brief and occasioned by a faulty rudder, and the furious wind over the ice shelf after we cleared the great plateau. In 5 days more, the Arkham and Miskatonic, with all hands and equipment on board, were shaking clear of the thickening field ice and working up Ross Sea, with the mocking mountains of Victoria Land looming westward against the troubled Antarctic sky and twisting the wind's wails into a wide-range musical piping which chilled my soul to the quick. Less than a fortnight later, we left the last hint to polar land behind us, and thanked heaven that we were clear of a haunted, accursed realm, where life and death, space and time, had made black and blasphemous alliances in the unknown epochs since matter first arrived and swam on the planet's scarce cooled crust. Since our return, we have all constantly worked to discourage Antarctic exploration, and have kept certain doubts and guesses to ourselves with splendid unity and faithfulness. Even young Danforth, with his nervous breakdown, has not flinched or babbled to his doctors. Indeed, as I have said, there was one thing he thinks he alone saw which he will not tell even me, though I think it would help his psychological state if he would consent to do so. It might explain and relieve much, though perhaps the thing was no more than the delusive aftermath of an earlier shock. That is the impression I gather after those rare, irresponsible moments when he whispers disjointed things to me, things which he repudiates vehemently as soon as he gets a grip on himself again. It'll be hard work deterring others from the great white South, and some of our efforts may directly harm our cause. By drawing inquiring notice, we might have known from the first that human curiosity is undying, and that the result we announced that would be enough to spur others ahead on the same age-long pursuit of the unknown. Lake's reports of those biological monstrosities has aroused naturalists and paleontologists to the highest pitch, though we were sensible enough not to show the detached parts we had taken from the actual buried specimens, or photographs of those specimens as they were found. We also refrained from showing the more puzzling of the scarred bones and greenish soapstones, while Danforth and I have closely guarded the pictures we took or drew on the super plateau across the range, and the crumpled things we smoothed, studied in terror, and brought away in our pockets. But now that Stark Weathermore party is organizing, with a thoroughness far beyond anything our outfit attempted, if not dissuaded, they will get to the innermost nucleus of the Antarctic and melt and bore till they bring up all that we know bring up that which we know may end the world. So I must break through all the reticences at last, even about the ultimate nameless thing beyond the mountains of madness. Okay. Chapter 4. It is only with vast hesitancy and repugnance that I let my mind go back to Lake's camp and what we really found there, and to the other thing beyond the awful mountain wall. Break through the routine. Welcome in, flag fisherman. I have told that the wind-ravaged terrain, the damaged shelters, the disarranged machinery, the varied uneasiness of our dog, the missing sledges and other items, the deaths of men and dogs, the absence of Gedney, and 6 insanely buried biological specimens, strangely sound in texture for all their structural injuries, from a world 40 million years dead. I do not recall whether I mentioned that upon checking the canine bodies we found one dog missing. We did not think much about that until later. Indeed, only Danforth and I have thought of it at all. The principal thing I've been keep back related to the bodies, and to certain settled points which may or may not lend a hideous and incredible kind of rationale to the apparent chaos. At the time, I tried to keep the men's minds off those points, for it was so much simpler, so much more normal to lay everything to an outbreak of madness on the part of some of Lake's party. From the look of things, that demon mountain wind must have been enough to drive any man mad in the midst of this center of all earthly mystery and desolation. The crowning abnormality of all was the condition of the bodies, men and dogs alike. They had all been in some terrible kind of conflict, and were torn and mangled in fiendish and altogether inexplicable ways. Death, so far as we could judge, had in each case come from strangulation or laceration. The dogs had evidently started the trouble, for the state of their ill-built corral bore witness to its forcible breakage from within. It had been set some distance from the camp because of the hatred of the animals for those hellish archaean organisms, but the precaution seemed to have been taken in vain. When left alone in the monstrous wind, behind flimsy walls of insufficient height, they must have stampeded, whether from the wind itself or from some subtly increasing odor emanated by the nightmare specimens. Citizens, one could not say. But whatever had happened, it was hideous and revolting enough. Perhaps I had better put squeamishness aside and tell the worst at last, though with categorical statement of opinion, based on the first-hand observations and most rigid deductions of both Danforth and myself, that the then missing Gedney was in no way responsible for the loathsome horrors we found. I have said that the bodies were frightfully mangled. Now I must add that some were incised and subtracted from in the most curious cold-blooded and inhuman fashion. It was the same with dogs and men. All the healthier, fatter bodies, quadrupedal or bipedal, had their most solid masses of tissue cut out and removed as by a careful butcher, and around them was a strange sprinkling of salt, taken from the ravaged provision chest on the plains, which conjured up the most horrible associations. The thing had occurred in one of the crude airplane shelters from which the plane had been dragged out, and subsequent winds had effaced all tracks from which could have supplied any plausible theory. Scattered bits of clothing roughly slashed from the human incision, subjected, hinted, oh my gosh, sorry. Scattered bits of clothing roughly slashed from the inhuman incision subjects hinted no clues. It is useless to bring up the half impressions of certain faint snow prints in one shielded corner of the ruined enclosure, because that impression did not concern human prints at all, but was clearly mixed up with all the talk of fossil prints which poor Lake had been giving throughout the preceding weeks. One had to be careful of one's imagination in the ice of those overshadowing mountains of madness. As I have indicated, Gedney and one dog turned out to be missing in the end. When we came on that terrible shelter, we had missed 2 dogs and 2 men, but the fairly unharmed dissecting tent, which we revealed after investigating the monstrous graves, had something to reveal. It was not as Lake had left it, for the covered parts of the primal monstrosity had been removed from the improvised table. Indeed, we had already realized that one of the 6 imperfect and insanely buried things we had found, the one with the traces of a peculiarly hateful odor, must represent the collected sections of the entity which Lake had tried to analyze. On and around the laboratory table were strewn other things, and it did not take long for us to guess that those things were the carefully, though oddly and inexpertly dissected parts of 1 man and 1 dog. I shall spare the feelings of survivors by omitting mention of the man's identity. Legs and anatomical instruments were missing, but there were evidences of their careful cleansing. The gasoline stove was also gone, though around it was a curious litter of matches. We buried the human parts beside the other 10 men, and the canine parts with the other 35 dogs. Concerning the bizarre smudges on the laboratory table and the jumble of roughly handed illustrated books scattered near it, we were much too bewildered to speculate. This formed the worst of the camp horror, but other things were equally perplexing. The disappearance of Gedney, the 1 dog, the 8 uninjured biological specimens, 3 sledges, and the certain instruments, illustrated technical and scientific books, writing materials, electric torches and batteries, food and fuel, heating apparatus, spare tents, fursuits, and the like, was utterly beyond sane conjecture, as were likewise the sputter-fringed inkblots and certain pieces of paper, and the evidences of curious alien fumbling and experimentation around the planes, and all other mechanical devices, both at the camp and at the boring. The dogs seemed to abhor this oddly disordered machinery. Then, too, there was the upsetting of the larder, the disappearance of certain staples, and the jarringly comical heap of tin cans pried open in the most unlikely ways and at the most unlikely places. The profusion of scattered matches, intact, broken, or spent, formed another minor enigma, as did the 2 or 3 tent cloths and fur suits which we found lying about with peculiar and unorthodox slashings, conceivably due to clumsy efforts at unimaginable adaptations. The maltreatment of the human and canine bodies, and the crazy burial of the damaged archaean specimens, were all of a piece with this apparent disintegrative madness. In view of just such an eventuality as the present one, we carefully photographed all the main evidence of insane disorder at the camp, and shall use the prints to buttress our pleas against the departure of the proposed Starkweather Moor expedition. Our first act after finding the bodies in the shelter was to photograph and open the row of insane graves with the five-pointed snow mounds. We could not help noticing the resemblance of these monstrous mounds with their clusters of grouped dots to poor Lake's descriptions of the strained greenish soapstones, and when we came on some of the soapstones themselves in the great mineral pile, we found the likeness very close indeed. The whole general formation, it must be made clear, seemed abominably suggestive of the starfish head of the archaean entities, and we agreed that the suggestion must have worked potently upon the sensitive minds of of Lake's overwrought party. For madness, centering in Gedney as the only possible surviving agent, was the explanation and spontaneously adopted by everybody so far as a spoken utterance was concerned. Though I will not be so naive as to deny that each of us may have harbored wild guesses, which sanity forbade him to formulate completely. Sherman, Pobody, and McTee made an extensive airplane cruise over all the surrounding territory in the afternoon, sweeping their horizon with the field glasses in quest of any of the various missing things, but nothing came to light. The party reported that the Titan barrier range extended endlessly to right and left alike, without any diminution in height or essential structure. On some of the peaks, though, the regular cube and rampart formations were bolder and plainer, having doubly fantastic similitudes to Rorik-painted Asian hill ruins. The distribution of cryptical cave mouths of the black snow-denuded summits seemed roughly even as far as the range could be traced. In spite of all the prevailing horrors, we were left with enough sheer scientific zeal and adventurousness to wonder about the unknown realm beyond those mysterious mountains. As our guarded messages stated, we rose at midnight after our day of terror and bafflement, but not without a tentative plan for one or more range-crossing altitude flights in a lightened plane with aerial camera and geologist outfit, beginning the following morning. It was decided that Danforth and I try it first, and we awaked at 7 a.m., intending on early trip, though heavy winds mentioned in our brief bulletin to the outside world delay our start till nearly 9 o'clock. I have already repeated the non-committal story we told the men at camp and relayed outside after our return 16 hours later. It is now my terrible duty to amplify this account by filling in the merciful blanks with hints of what we really saw in the hidden transmountain world, hints of the revelations which have finally driven Danforth to a nervous collapse. I wish he would add a really frank word about the thing which he thinks he saw alone, even though it was probably a nervous delusion, and which was perhaps the last straw that put him where he is. But he is firm against that. All I can do is repeat his later disjointed whispers about what set him shrieking as the plane soared back through the wind-tortured mountains, passed after that real intangible shock which I shared. This will form my last word. If the plain sightings of surviving elder horrors in what I'd disclose be not enough to keep others from meddling with the inner Antarctic, or at least from prying too deeply beneath the surface of that ultimate waste of forbidden secrets and unhuman, aeon-cursed desolation, the responsible for unnameable and perhaps immeasurable evils will not be mine. Danforth and I studied the notes made by Pobody in his afternoon flight, and checking up with Sextant had calculated that the lowest available pass in the range lay somewhat to the right of us, within sight of camp and about 23,000 or 24,000 feet above sea level. For this point, then, we first headed in the lightened plane as we embarked on our flight of discovery. The camp itself on foothills which sprang from a high continental plateau was some 12,000 feet in altitude. Hence the actual height increasing necessary was not so vast as it might seem. Nevertheless, we were acutely conscious of the rarefied air and intense cold as we rose, for on account of visibility conditions we had to leave the cabin windows open. We were dressed, of course, in our heaviest furs. As we drew near the forbidding peaks dark and sinister above the line of crevasse-riven snow and interstitial glaciers, we noticed more and more the curiously regular formations clinging to the slopes, and thought again of the strange Asian paintings of Nicholas Roerich. The ancient and wind-weathered rock strata fully verified all of Lake's bulletins, and proved that these pinnacles had been towering up in exactly the same way since a surprising early time in Earth's history. Perhaps over 50 million years, but how much higher they had once been it was futile to guess. but everything about this strange region pointed to obscure atmospheric influences unfavorable to change, and calculated to retard the usual climactic processes of rock disintegration. But it was the mountain's side tangle of regular cubes, ramparts, and cave mouths which fascinated and disturbed us most. I studied them with a field glass and took aerial photographs while Danforth drove, and at times I relieved him at the controls. Through my aviation knowledge was purely an amateur's in order to let him use the binoculars. We could easily see that much of the material of the things was a lightish Archean quartzite, unlike any formation visible over broad areas of the general surface, and that their regularity was extreme and uncanny to an extent which poor Lake had scarcely hinted. As he had said, their edges were crumbling and rounded from untold aeons of savage weathering, but their preternatural solidity and tough material had saved them from obliteration. Many parts, especially those closest to the slopes, seemed identical in substance with the surrounding rock surface. The whole arrangement looked like the ruins of Machu Picchu in the Andes, or the primal foundation walls of Kish as dug up by the Oxford Field Museum expedition in 1929, and both Danforth and I obtained that occasional impression of separate cyclopean blocks, which Lake had attributed to his flight companion Carol. How to account for such things in this place was frankly beyond me, and I felt queerly humble as a geologist. Igneous formations often have strange regularities, like the famous Giant's Causeway in Ireland, but this stupendous range, despite Lake's original suspicion of smoking cones, was above all else non-volcanic in evident structure. The curious cave mouths near which the odd formation seemed most abundant, presented another, albeit a lesser puzzle, because of their regularity of outline. They were, as Lake's bulletin had said, often approximately square or semicircular, as if the natural orifices had been shaped to greater symmetry by some magic hand. Their numerousness and wide distribution were remarkable, and suggested that the whole region was honeycombed with tunnels dissolved out of limestone strata. Such glimpses as we secured did not extend far with the caverns, but we saw that they were apparently clear of stalactites and stalagmites. Outside, those parts of the mountain slopes adjoining the apertures seemed invariably smooth and regular, and Danforth thought that the slight cracks and pitings of the weathering tended toward unusual patterns. Filled as he was with the horrors and strangeness discovered at the camp, he hinted with the pittings vaguely resembled those baffling groups of dots sprinkled over the primeval greenish soapstone, so hideously duplicated to the madly conceived snow mounds above those 6 buried monstrosities. We had risen gradually in flying over the higher foothills and along toward the relatively low pass we had selected. As we advanced, we occasionally looked down at the snow and ice of the land route, wondering whether we could have attempted the trip with the simpler equipment of earlier days. Somewhat to our surprise, we saw that the terrain was far from difficult, as such things go, that despite the crevasses and other bad spots, it would not have been likely to deter the sledges of a Scott, a Shackleton, or an Amundsen. Some of the glaciers appeared to lead up to wind-barred passes with unusual continuity, and upon reaching our chosen pass we found that its case formed no exception. Our sensations of tense expectancy, as we prepared to round the crest and peer out over an untrodden world, can hardly be described on paper. Even though we had no cause to think the regions beyond the range essentially different from those we had seen and traversed, the touch of evil mystery in those barrier mountains and in the beckoning sea of opalescent sky glimpsed betwixt their summits was a highly subtle and attenuated matter not to be explained in literal words. Rather, it was an affair of affair of vague psychological symbolism and aesthetic association. A thing mixed up with exotic poetry and painting and with archaic myths, lurking in shunned and forbidden volumes. Even the wind's burden held a peculiar strain of conscious malignity, and for a second it seemed that the composite sound included a bizarre musical whistling or piping over a wind range as the blast swept in and out of the omnipresent and resonant cave mouths. There was a cloudy note of reminiscent repulsion of the sound, as complex and unplaceable as any of the other dark impressions. We are now, after slow ascent, at a height of 23,570 feet according to the aneroid, and had left the region of clinging snow definitely below us. Up here there was only dark bare rock slopes and the start of rough-ribbed glaciers, but with those provocative cubes, ramparts, and echoing cave mouths to add a portent of the unnatural, the fantastic, and dreamlike. Looking along the line of high peaks, I thought I could see the one mentioned by poor Lake, with the rampart exactly on top. It seemed to be half lost in a queer Antarctic haze. Such a haze, perhaps, as had been responsible for Lake's early notion of volcanism. The pass loomed directly before us, smooth and windswept between its jagged and malignly frowning pylons. Beyond it was a sky fretted with swirling vapors, and lighted by the low polar sun, the sky of that mysterious farther realm upon which we felt no human eye had ever gazed. A few more feet of altitude, and we would behold that realm. Danforth and I, unable to speak except in shouts amidst the howling, piping wind that raced through the pass and added to the noise of the unmuffled engines, exchanged eloquent glances, and then, having gained those last few feet, we did indeed stare across the Munch's Divide and over the unsampled secrets of an elder and utterly alien earth. I think that both of us simultaneously cried out in mixed awe, wonder, terror, and disbelief in our own senses, as we finally cleared the pass and saw what lay beyond. Of course, we must have had some natural theory in the back of our heads to steady our faculties for the moment. Probably thought of such things as the grotesquely weathered stones of the Garden of the Gods in Colorado, or the fantastically symmetrical, wind-carved rocks of the Arizona desert. Perhaps we even half thought the sight a mirage like we had seen the morning on our first approaching those mountains of madness. We must have had some such normal notions to fall back upon as our eyes swept that limitless, tempest-scarred plateau and grasped the almost endless labyrinth of colossal, regular, and geometrical rhythmic stone masses which reared their crumbled and pitted crest above a glacial seat not more than 40 or 50 feet deep at its thickest, and in places obviously thinner. The effect of the monstrous sight was indescribable, for some fiendish violation of no natural law seemed certain at the outset. Here on a hellishly ancient tableland fully 20,000 feet high, and in a climate deadly to habitation since a pre-human age, not less than 500,000 years ago, there stretched nearly to the vision's limit, a tangle of orderly stone which only the desperation of mental self-defense could possibly attribute to any but a conscious and artificial cause. We had previously dismissed, so far as serious thought was concerned, any theory that the cubes and ramparts of the mountainside were other than natural in origin. How could they be otherwise when man himself could scarcely have been differentiated from the great apes at the time when this region succumbed to the present unbroken reign of glacial death? Yet now the sway of reason seemed irrefutably shaken, for this cyclopean maze of squared, curved, and angled blocks had features which cut off all comfortable refuge. It was very clearly the blasphemous city of the city of the mirage in stark objective and ineluctable reality, that damnable portent that had a material basis after all. There had been some horizontal stratum of ice dust in the upper air, and this shocking stone survival had projected its image across the mountains according to the simple laws of reflection. Of course, the phantom had been twisted and exaggerated, and had contained things which the real source did not contain. Yet now, as we saw what that real source, we thought it even more hideous and menacing than the distant image. Only the incredible, unhuman massiveness of those vast stone towers and ramparts had saved the frightful thing from utter annihilation. In the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years it had brooded there amidst the blasts of a bleak upland. Corona Mundi, roof of the world. All sorts of fantastic phrases sprang to our lips as we looked dizzily down at the unbelievable spectacle. I thought again of the eldritch primal myths that had so persistently haunted me since my first sight of this dead Antarctic world, of the demonic plateau of Leng, of the Mi-Go or the abominable snowmen of the Himalayas, or the narcotic manuscripts with their pre-human implications, or the Cthulhu cult of the Necronomicon, and the Hyperborean legends of formless Sathogwa and the worse than formless star spawn associated with that semi-entity. For boundless miles in every direction, the thing stretched off with very little thinning. Indeed, as our eyes followed it to the right and left along the base of the low, gradual foothills, which separated it from the actual mountain rim, we decided that we should see no thinning at all except for an interruption at the left of the pass through which we had come. We had merely struck at random a limited part of something of incalculable extent. The foothills were more sparsely sprinkled with grotesque stone structures, linking to the terrible city to the already familiar cubes and ramparts which evidently formed its mountain outposts. These latter, as well as the queer cave mountains, were as thick on the inner as on the outer side of the mountains. The nameless stone labyrinth consisted, for the most part, of walls from 10 to 150 feet in ice-clear height, and of thickness varying from 5 to 10 feet. It was composed mostly of prodigious blocks of dark primordial slate, schist and sandstone, blocks in many cases as large as 4 by 6 by 8 feet, though in several places it seemed to be carved out of a solid, uneven bedrock of pre-Cambrian slate. The buildings were far from equal in size, there being innumerable honeycomb arrangements of enormous extent, as well as smaller separate structures. The general shape of these things tended to be conical, pyramidal, or terraced, though there were many perfect cylinders, perfect cubes, clusters of cubes, and other rectangular forms, and in a peculiar sprinkling of angled edifices, whose five-pointed ground plan roughly suggested modern fortifications. The builders had made constant and expert use of the principle of the arch, and domes had probably existed in the city's heyday. The whole tangle was monstrously weathered, and the glacial surface from where the tower projected was strewn with fallen blocks and immemorial debris. Where the glaciation was transparent, we could see the lower parts of the gigantic piles, and we noticed the ice-preserved stone bridges which connected the different towers at varying distances above the ground. On the exposed walls we could detect the scarred places where other and higher bridges of the same sort had existed. Closer inspection revealed countless largish windows, some of which were closed with shutters of a petrified material originally wood, though most gaped open in a sinister and menacing fashion. Many of the ruins, of course, were roofless, and with uneven though wind-rounded upper edges, whilst others, of a more sharply conical or pyramidal model, or else protected by higher surrounding structures, preserved intact outlines despite the omnipresent crumbling and pitting. With the field glass we could barely make out what seemed to be sculptural decorations in horizontal bands, decorations including those curious groups of dots whose presence on the ancient soapstones now assumed a vastly larger significance. In many places, the buildings were totally ruined and the ice sheet deeply riven from various geologic causes. In other places, the stonework was worn down to the very level of the glaciation. One broad swathe extending from the plateau's interior to a cleft in the foothills, about a mile to the left of the pass we had traversed, was wholly free from buildings. It had probably represented, we concluded, the course of some great river which in tertiary times, millions of years ago, had poured through the city and into some prodigious subterranean abyss of the Great Barrier Range. Certainly this was above all a region of caves, gulfs, and underground secrets beyond human penetration. Looking back to our sensations and recalling our dazedness at viewing this monstrous survival from aeons we had thought pre-human, I can only wonder what we preserved the semblance of equilibrium, which we did. Of course, we knew that something chronologically scientific theory or our own consciousness was woefully awry, yet we kept enough poised to guide the plane, observe many things quite minutely, and take a careful series of photographs which may yet serve both us and the world in good stead. In my case, ingrained scientific habit may have helped, for above all my bewilderment and sense of menace, there burned a dominant curiosity to fathom more of this age-old secret, to know what sort of beings had built and lived in this incalculably gigantic place, and what relation to the general world of its time, or of other times so unique a concentration of life could have had. For this could be no ordinary city. It must have formed the primary nucleus and center of some archaic and unbelievable chapter of Earth's history, whose outward ramifications, recalled only dimly in the most obscure and distorted myths, had vanished utterly amidst the chaos of terrain convulsions long before any human race we know had shambled out of apedom. Here sprawled the Pelagian megalopolis, compared with which the fabled Atlantis and Lemuria, Camorium, and Uzaldaum, and Olatho, and the land of Lomar were such things of today, not even of yesterday. A megalos ranking with such whispered pre-human blasphemies as Valusia, Riley, even the land of Binar, and the nameless city of Arabia Deserta. As we flew above that tangle of stark Titan towers, my imagination sometimes escaped all bounds, and roved aimlessly in the realms of fantastic associations. Even links betwixt this lost world and some of my own wildest dreams concerned the mad horrors of the camp. The plane's fuel tank, in the interest of greater lightness, had been only partly filled, hence we now had to exert caution in our explorations. Even so, we covered an enormous extent of ground, or rather air, after swooping down to a level where the wind became virtually negligible. There seemed to be no limit to the mountain range, or to the length of the frightful stone city which bordered its inner foothills. 50 miles of flight in each direction showed no major change in the labyrinth of rock and masonry that clawed up corpse-like through the eternal ice. There were, though, some highly absorbing diversifications, such as the carvings on the canyon where that broad river had once pierced the foothills and approached its sinking place in the greater range. The headlands at the stream's entrance had been boldly carved into cyclopean pylons, and something about the rigidly barrel-shaped design stirred up oddly vague, hateful, and confusing semi-remembrances in both Danforth and me. We also came upon several star-shaped open spaces, evidently public squares, and noted various undulations in the terrain. Where a sharp hill rose, it was generally hollowed out in some sort of rambling stone edifice, but there were at least 2 exceptions. Of these latter, one was too badly weathered to disclose what once been on the jutting eminence, while the other still bore a fantastical conical monument carved out of solid rock and roughly resembling such things as the well-known snake tomb in the ancient valley of Petra. Flying inland from the mountains, we discovered that the city was not of infinite width, even though its length along the foothills seemed endless. After about 30 miles, the grotesque stone buildings began to thin out, and in 10 more miles we came to an unbroken waste virtually without signs of sentient artifice. The course of the river beyond the city seemed marked by a broad, depressed line, while the land assumed a somewhat greater ruggedness, seeming to slope slightly upward as it receded in the mist haze west. So far, we had made no landing, yet to leave the plateau without an attempt at entering some of the monstrous structure would have been inconceivable. Accordingly, we decided to find a smooth place in the foothills near our navigable pass, there grounding the plane and preparing to do some exploration on foot. Though these gradual slopes were partly covered with a scattering of ruins, low flying soon disclosed an ample number of possible landing places. Selecting that nearest to the pass, since our next flight would be across the Great Range and back to camp, we succeeded about 12:30 p.m. in coming down on a smooth, hard snow field, wholly devoid of obstacles and well adapted to a swift and favorable takeoff later on. It did not seem necessary to protect the plane with a snow banking for so brief a time, and in so comfortable an absence of high winds at this level. Hence, we merely saw that the landing skis were safely lodged, and the vital parts of the mechanism were guarded against the cold. For a foot journey, we discarded the heaviest of our flying furs, and took with us a small outfit consisting of pocket compass, hand camera, light provisions, voluminous notebooks and paper, geologist hammer and chisel, specimen bags, coils of climbing rope, and powerful electric torches with extra batteries. This equipment having been carried in the plane on the chance that we might be able to effect a landing, take ground pictures, make drawings and topographical sketches, and obtain rock specimens from some bare slope, outcropping or mountain cave. Fortunately, we had a supply of extra paper to tear up, place in a spare specimen bag, and use on the ancient principle of hare and hounds for marking our course in any interior mazes which we might be able to penetrate. This had been brought in case we found some cave system with air quiet enough to allow such a rapid and easy method in place of the usual rock-chipping method of trailblazing. Walking cautiously downhill over the crusted snow toward this stupendous stone labyrinth that loomed against the opalescent west, we felt almost a keen sense of imminent marvels as we had felt on approaching the unfathomed mountain pass 4 hours previously. True, we had become visibly familiar with the incredible secret concealed by the barrier peaks, yet the prospect of actually entering primordial walls, reared by conscious beings perhaps millions of years ago, before any known race of men could have existed, was none the less awesome and potentially terrible in its implications of cosmic abnormality. Through the thinness of the prodigious altitude made exertion somewhat more difficulty than usual. Both Danforth and I found ourselves bearing up well, and felt equal to almost any task which might fall to our lot. It took only a few steps to bring us to a shapeless, ruin-worn level, with the snow, while 10 or 5 rods gathered on there was a huge roofless rampart still complete in its gigantic 5-pointed outline, and rising to an irregular height of 10 or 11 feet. For this latter we headed, when at last we were actually able to touch its withered cyclopean blocks. We felt that we had established an unprecedented and almost blasphemous link with forgotten aeons normally closed to our species. This rampart, shaped like a star and perhaps 300 feet from point to point, was built of Jurassic sandstone blocks of irregular size, averaging 6 by 8 feet in surface. There was a row of arched loopholes for windows, about 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, spaced quite symmetrically along the points of the star, and at its inner angles, and with bottoms about 4 feet from the glaciated surface. Looking through these, we could see the masonry was fully 5 feet thick, that there were no partitions remaining within, and that there were traces of banded carvings or bas-reliefs on the interior walls, facts which we had guessed before, when flying low over this rampart, and others like it. The lower parts must have originally existed. All traces of such things were now wholly obscured by the deep layer of ice and snow at this point. We crawled through one of the windows and vainly tried to decipher the nearly effaced mural designs, but did not attempt to disturb the glaciated floor. Our orientation flights had indicated that many buildings in the city proper were less ice-choked, and they might find wholly clear interiors leading down to the true ground level if we entered those structures still roofed at the top. Before we left the rampart, we photographed it carefully and studied its mortarless cyclopean masonry with complete bewilderment. We wished that Kobold were present, for his engineering knowledge might have helped us guess how such gigantic blocks could have been handled in that unbelievably remote age when the city and its outskirts were built up. Okay, we gotta do an ad break, and then we'll be right back. So I will see you in just a few minutes. Okay, I'm back to the later. All right. Half-mile walk downhill to the actual city, the upper wind shrieking vainly and savagely through the skyward peaks in the background, was something of which the smallest detail will always remain engraved on my mind. Only in fantastic nightmares could any human beings but Danforth and me conceive such optical effects. Between us and the churning vapors of the west lay that monstrous tangle of dark stone towers, its outer and incredible forms impressing us afresh at every new angle of vision. It was a mirage in solid stone, and were it not for the photographs, I would still doubt that such a thing could be. The general type of masonry was identical with that of the ramparts we had examined, but the extravagant shapes which this masonry took in its urban manifestations were all description. Even the pictures illustrate only one or two phases of its endless variety. Preternatural massiveness and utterly alien exoticism. There were geometrical forms for which an Euclid could scarcely find a name. Cones of all degrees of irregularity and truncation, terraces of every sort of provocative disproportion, shafts with odd bulbous enlargements, broken columns in curious groups, and five-pointed or five-ridged arrangements of mad grotesqueness. As we drew near, we could see beneath certain transparent parts of the ice sheet, and detect some of the tubular stone bridges that connected the crazily sprinkled structures at various heights. Of orderly streets there seemed to be none, the only broad opens with swathe being a mile to the left, where the ancient river had doubtless flowed the town into the mountains. Our field glasses showed the external horizontal bands of nearly effaced sculptures and dot groups to be very prevalent, and we could half imagine what the city must once have looked like, even though most of the roofs and tower tops had necessarily perished. As a whole, it would have been a complex tangle of twisted lanes and alleys, all of them deep canyons and some little better than tunnels because of the overhanging masonry or overarching bridges. Now outspread below us, it loomed like a dream fantasy against a westward mist. Through those northern end, the low, reddish Antarctic sun of early afternoon was struggling to shine, and when for a moment that sun encountered a denser obstruction and plunged the scene into temporary shadow, the effect was subtly menacing in a way I can never hope to depict. Even the faint howling and piping of the unfelt wind in the great mountain pass took us on a wilder note of purposeful malignity. The last stage of our descent to the town was unusually steep and abrupt, and the rock outcropping at the edge where the grade change led to think that an artificial terrace had once existed there. Under the glaciation, we believed there must be a flight of steps or its equivalent. When at last we plunged into the town itself, clambering over fallen masonry and shrinking from the oppressive nearness and dwarfing height of omnipresent crumbling and pitted walls, our sensations again came forth that I marvel at the amount of self-control we retained. Danforth was frankly jumpy and began making some offensively irreverent speculations about the horror at the camp, which I resented all the more because I could not help sharing certain conclusions forced upon us by many features of this morbid survival from nightmare antiquity. The speculations worked on his imagination too, or in one place, where a debris-littered alley turned into a sharp corner, he insisted that he saw faint traces of ground markings which he did not like, while elsewhere he stopped to listen to a subtle imaginary sound from some undefined point. A muffled musical piping, he said, not unlike that of the wind in the mountain caves, yet somehow disturbingly different. The ceaseless five-pointedness of the surrounding architecture, and a few distinguishable mirror arabesques had a dimly sinister suggestiveness we could not escape, and gave us a touch of terrible conscious certainty concerning the primal entities which had reared and dwelt in this unhallowed place. Nevertheless, our scientific and adventurous souls were not wholly dead, and we mechanically carried out our program of chipping specimens from all the different rock types presented in the masonry. We wished a rather full set in order to draw better conclusions regarding the age of the place. Nothing in the great outer walls seemed to date from later than the Jurassic and Comanchian periods, nor was any piece of stone at the entire place of a greater recency than the Pleistocene age. In stark certainty, we were wandering amidst a death which had reigned at least 500,000 years, in all probability even longer. As we proceeded through this maze of stone at twilight, we stopped at all available apertures to study interiors and investigate entrance possibilities. Some were above our reach, while others led only into ice-choked ruins as unroofed and barren as the rampart on the hill. One, though spacious and inviting, opened on a seemingly bottomless abyss without visible means of descent. And then we had a chance to study the petrified wood of a surviving shutter, and we were impressed by the fabulous antiquity implied in the still discernible grain. The thing had come from Mesozoic gymnosperms and conifers, especially Cretaceous cycads, and from fan palms and early angiosperms of plainly tertiary date. Nothing definitely later than the Pliocene could be discovered. In the placing of these shutters, whose edges showed the former presence of queer and long-vanished hinges, usage seemed to be varied, some other being on the outer and some on the inner side of the deep embrasures. They seemed to have become wedged in place, thus surviving the rusting of their former and probably metallic fixtures and fastenings. After a time we came across a row of windows in the bulges of a colossal five-edged cone of undamaged apex, which led into a vast, well-preserved room with stone flooring. But these were too high in the room to permit descent without a rope. We had a rope with us, but did not wish to bother with this 20-foot drop unless obliged to. Earlier in this thin plateau air where great demands were made upon the heart action. This enormous room was probably a hall or concourse of some sort, and our electric torches showed bold, distinct, and potentially startling sculptures arranged around the walls in broad horizontal bands, separated by equally broad strips of conventional arabesques. We took careful note of this spot, planning to enter here unless a more easily gained interior was encountered. Finally, though, we did encounter exactly the opening we wished, an archway about 6 feet wide and 10 feet high, marking the former end of an aerial bridge which had spanned an alley about 5 feet above the present level of glaciation. These archways, of course, were flush with upper story floors, and in this case one of the floors still existed. The building thus accessible was a series of rectangular terraces on our left, facing westward. That across the alley where the other archway yawned was a decrepit cylinder, with no windows and with a curious bulge about 10 feet above the aperture. It was totally dark inside, and the archway seemed to open on a well of illimitable emptiness. Heaped debris made the entrance to the vast left-handed building doubly easy, yet for a moment we hesitated before taking advantage of the long-wished chance. For though we had penetrated in this tangle of archaic mystery, it required fresh resolution to carry us us actually inside a complete and surviving building of a fabulous elder world whose nature was becoming more and more hideously plain to us. In the end, however, we made the plunge and scrambled up over the rabble into the gaping embrasure. The floor beyond was of great slate slabs, and seemed to form the outlet of a long, high corridor with sculptured walls. Observing the many inner archways which led off from it, and realizing the probable complexity of the nest of apartments within, we decided that we must skin our system of the hare and hound trail blazing. Hitherto our compasses, together with frequent glimpses of the vast mountain range between the towers in our rear, had been enough to prevent our losing our way, but from now on the artificial substitute would be necessary. Accordingly, we reduced our extra bag to shreds of suitable size, placed them in a bag to be carried by Danforth, and prepared to use them as economically as safety would allow. This method would probably gain us immunity from straying, since there did not appear to be any strong air currents inside the primordial masonry. If such should develop, or if our paper supply should give out, we could of course fall back on the more secure, though tedious and retarding method of rock chipping. Just how extensive a terror we had opened up, it was possible to guess without a trial. The close and frequent connection of the different buildings made it likely that we might cross from one to another on bridges underneath the ice, except where impeded by local collapses and geologic rifts, for very little glaciation seemed to have entered the massive constructions. Almost all the areas of transparent ice had revealed the submerged windows as tightly shuttered, as if the town had been left in that uniform state until the shell sheet came to crystallize the lower part for all succeeding time. Indeed, one gained a curious impression that this place had been deliberately closed and deserted in some dim bygone era, rather than overwhelmed by a sudden calamity or even gradual decay. Had the coming of the ice been foreseen, and had a nameless population left en masse to seek a less doomed abode? The precise physiographic conditions attending the formulation of the ice sheet at this point would have to wait for later solution. It had not, very plainly, been a grinding drive. Perhaps the pressure of accumulated snows had been responsible, and perhaps some flood from the river, or from the bursting of some ancient glacial dam in the Great Range, had helped to create the special state now observable. Imagination could conceive almost anything in connection with this place. It would be cumbrous to give a detailed consecutive account of our wanderings inside that cavernous, aeon-dead honeycomb of primal masonry, that monstrous lair of elder secrets which now echoed for the first time after uncounted epochs of the tread of human feet. This is especially true because of so much of the horrible drama and revelation came from mere study of the omnipresent mural carvings. Our flashlight photographs of those carvings will do much toward proving the truth of what we are now disclosing, and it is lamentable that we had not a larger film supply with us. As it was, we made crude notebook sketches of certain salient features. After all, our films were used up. The building which he had entered was one of great size and elaborateness, and gave us an impressive notion of the architecture of that nameless geologic past. The inner partitions were less massive than the outer walls, but on the lower levels were excellently preserved. Labyrinthine complexity, involving certain curiously irregular differences in floor levels, characterized the entire arrangement, and we should have certainly been at loss at the very outfit, but for the trail of torn paper left behind us. We decided to explore the more decrepit upper parts first of all, hence climbed aloft in the maze for a distance of some 100 feet, to where the topmost tier of chambers yawned snowily and ruinously open to the polar sky. Ascent was effected over the steep, diversely ribbed stone ramps or inclined planes, which everywhere served in lieu of stairs. The room we encountered were of all imaginable shapes and proportions, ranging from five-pointed stars to triangles and perfect cubes. It might be safe to say that their general average was about 30 by 30 feet in floor area, and 20 feet in height, though many larger apartments existed. After thoroughly examining the upper regions and the glacial level, we descended story by story into the submerged part, where indeed we saw soon we were in a continuous maze of connected chambers and passages, probably leading over unlimited areas outside this particular building. The cyclopean massiveness and giganticism of everything about us became curiously oppressive, and there was something vaguely but deeply inhuman in all the contours, dimensions, proportions, decorations, and constructional nuances of the blasphemously archaic stonework. We soon realized that from what the carvings revealed that this monstrous city was many millions years old. We cannot yet explain the engineering principle used in the anomalous balancing and adjustment of the vast rock masses. Though the function of the art was clearly much relied on, the rooms we visited were wholly bare of all portable contents, a circumstance which sustained our belief in the city's deliberate desertion. The prime decorative feature was the almost universal system of mural sculpture, which tended to run in continuously horizontal bands, 3 feet wide, and arranged from floor to ceiling, in alternation with bands of equal width given over to geometrical arabesques. There were certain exceptions to this rule of arrangement, but its preponderousness was overwhelming. Often, however, a series of smooth cartridges containing oddly patterned groups of dots would be sunk along one of the arabesque bands. The technique, as we soon saw, was mature, accomplished, and aesthetically evolved to the highest degree of civilized mastery. Though utterly alien in every detail to any known art tradition of the human race, in delicacy of execution no sculpture I have ever seen could approach it. The minutest details of elaborate vegetation, or of animal life, were rendered with astonishing vividness despite the bold scale of the carvings, whilst the conventional designs were marvels of skill and intricacy. The arabesques displayed a profound use of mathematical principles, and were made up of obscurely symmetrical curves and angles based on the quantity of 5. The pictorial bands followed a highly formalized tradition, and involved a peculiar treatment of perspective, but had an artistic force that moved as profoundly notwithstanding the intervening gulf of vast geologic periods. Their method of design hinged on a singular juxtaposition of the cross-section with the two-dimensional silhouette, and embodied an analytical psychology beyond that of any known race of antiquity. It is useless to try to compare this art with any represented in our museums. Those who see our photographs will probably find its closest analog in certain grotesque conceptions of the most daring futurists. The arabesque tracery consisted altogether of depressed lines, whose depth on unweathered walls varied from 1 to 2 inches. When cartouches with dot groups appeared, evidently as inscriptions in some unknown and primordial language and alphabet, the depression of the smooth surface was perhaps 1.5 inches, and of the dots perhaps a half-inch more. The pictorial bands were in countersunk low relief, their backgrounds being depressed about 2 inches from the original wall surface. In some specimens, marks of a former coloration could be detected, though for the most part of the untold aeons had disintegrated and banished any pigments from which may have applied. The more one studied the marvelous technique, the more one admired the things. Beneath their strict conventionalization, one could grasp the minute and accurate observation and graphic skill of the artist, and indeed the very conventions themselves serve to symbolize and accentuate the very essence or vital differentiations of every object delineated. We felt, too, that besides these recognizable excellences, there were others lurking beyond the reach of our perceptions. Certain touches here and there gave vague hints of latent symbols and stimuli which another mental and emotional background and a fuller or different sensory equipment might have made a profound and poignant significance to us. The subject matter of the sculptures obviously came from the life of the vanished epoch of their creation, and contained a large proportion of evident history. It is this abnormal historic minuteness of the primal race a chance circumstance operating through coincidence miraculously in our favor, which made the carving awesomely so awesomely informative to us, and which caused us to place their photography and transcription above all considerations. In certain rooms, the dominant arrangements were varied by the presence of maps, astronomical charts, and other scientific designs on a large scale. These things giving a naive and terrible corroboration to what we gathered from the pictorial friezes and dados, and hinting at what the whole revealed. I can only hope that my account will not arouse a greater curiosity than sane caution on the part of those who believe me at all. It would be tragic if any were to be allured to that realm of death and horror by the very warning meant to discourage them. Interrupting these sculptured walls were high windows and massive 12-foot doorways, both now and then retaining the petrified wooden planks, elaborately carved and polished, of the actual shutters and doors. All metal fixtures had long ago vanished, but some of the doors remained in place and had to be forced aside as we progressed from room to room. Window frames with odd, transparent panes, mostly elliptical, survived here and there, though in no considerable quantity. There were also frequent niches of great magnitude, generally empty, but once in a while containing some bizarre object carved from green soapstone, which was either broken or perhaps held too inferior to warrant removal. Other apertures were undoubtedly connected with bygone mechanical facilities, heating, lighting, and the like, of a sort suggested in many of the carvings. Ceilings tended to be plain, but had sometimes been inlaid with green soapstone, or other tiles, mostly fallen now. Floors were also paved with such tiles, though plain stonework predominated. As I have said, all furniture and other movables were absent, but the sculptures gave a clear idea of the strange devices which had once filled these tomb-like echoing rooms. Above the glacial sheet of the floors were generally thick with detritus, litter, and debris, but farther down this condition decreased. In some of the lower chambers and corridors there was little more than gritty dust or ancient incrustations, while the occasional area had an uncanny air of newly swept immaculateness. Of course, where rifts or collapses had occurred, the lower levels were as littered as the upper ones. A central court, as we had seen in other structures from the air, saved the inner regions from total darkness, that we seldom had to use our electric torches in the upper rooms except when studying sculpted details. Below the ice cap, however, the twilight deepened. In many parts of the tangled ground level there was an approach to absolute blackness. To form even a rudimentary idea of our thoughts and feelings as we penetrate this aeon-silent maze of unhuman masonry, one must correlate a hopelessly bewildering chaos of fugitive moods, memories, and impressions. The sheer appalling antiquity and lethal desolations of the place were enough to overwhelm almost any sensitive person. But, added to those elements were the recent unexplained horror at the camp, and the revelations all too soon effected by the terrible mural sculptures around us. The moment we came upon a perfect section of carving, where no ambiguity of interpretation could exist, it took only a brief study to give us the hideous truth, a truth which would be naive to claim Danforth and I had not independently suspected before, though we had carefully refrained from even hinting it to each other. There could be now no further merciful doubt about the nature of the beings which had built and inhabited this monstrous dead city of millions of years ago, when man's ancestors were primitive, archaic mammals, and vast dinosauria roamed the tropical steppes of Europe and Asia. We had previously clung to a desperate alternative, insisted, each to himself, that the omnipresent, the five-pointed motif meant only some cultural or religious exaltation of the arcane natural object, which had so patently embodied the quality of five-pointedness, as decorative motifs of Minoan Crete exalted the sacred bull, those of Egypt the scarabaeus, those of Rome the wolf and eagle, and those of various tribes some chosen totem animal. But this lone refuge was now stripped from us, and we were forced to face definitely the reason-shaking realization which the reader of these pages had doubtless long ago anticipated. I can scarcely bear to write it down in black and white even now, but perhaps that will not be necessary. I dropped something. Hold on. Okay. Managed to pick up what I dropped. We're good. Mm. Oh. Hey, thank you so much, Orange Onion. Thank you so much for the subscription. I really appreciate that. Yeah, 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 yeah. But yes, thank you so much. I really do appreciate that so much. And congratulations to Spooky Cat Kevin. I hope you enjoy your emotes. I can read. All right. Well, yes, enjoy your emotes. And once again, thank you so much to Orange Onion for your continued support. It really is tremendous. Thank you so much. Okay. Oh. All right. The things once rearing and dwelling in this frightful masonry in the age of Dinosauria were not indeed Dinosauria, but far worse. Mere Dinosauria were new and almost brainless objects, but the builders of the city were wise and old, and left certain traces in rock even then laid down well nigh 1,000 million years. Rocks that laid down before the true life of Earth had advanced beyond plastic groups of cells. Rocks laid down before the true life of Earth had existed at all. They were the makers and enslavers of that life, and above all, the originals of the fiendish elder myths which things like the Nicotic manuscripts in the Necronomicon affrightedly hint about. They were the great old ones that had filtered down from the stars when Earth was young, the beings whose substance an alien evolution had shaped, and whose powers were such as this planet had never bred. And to think that only the day before Danforth and I had actually looked upon their fragments of their millennial fossilized substance, and that poor Lake and his party had seen their complete outlines. It is, of course, impossible for me to relate in proper order the stages by which we know of that monstrous chapter of pre-human life. After the first shock of the certain revelation, we had to pause a while to recuperate, and it was fully 3 o'clock before we got started on our actual tour of systematic research. The sculptures in the buildings we entered were of relatively late date, perhaps 2 million years ago as checked by the geological, biological, and astronomical features, an embodiment in art which could be called decadent in comparison with that of specimens we found in older buildings after crossing the bridges under the glacial sheet. Oh. Oh, thank you so much for the Prime sub, Yami. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Ooh, congratulations on the 19 months. Gee, I exist still. Yes. We could never forgive our favorite deer. But yes, you will come on in. You can now use all the emotes again. By the way, once again, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Also, I'm your #1 sub fan. Oh wow. Congratulations. Heck yeah. I keep forgetting, but I need to make sure I make you stream via collab again. That deserves being a mola mola. Mola mola. Why do I not? Okay. Why is that not clicking? I feel like I know what that is, but it's not clicking in my brain hole. Oh. Ocean sunfish. Right. Okay. I'm dumb. I knew it sounded familiar. All I did was disappear. Oh, oops. I've seen some people being a mola mola, unlike the stream avatars. I don't know why it's. I've seen some people show up with that avatar, so I don't know why it's not showing up. Maybe you'll show up in a minute. Or wait, hold on. Maybe if I make y'all fight. Oops. Wrong button. Maybe if I make y'all fight, y'all show it up. Yours will show up in a second. Oh, there you go. Yay. You exist again. All right. The sculptures in the building we entered were of relatively late date, perhaps 2 million years, as checked by geological, biological, and astronomical features, and embodied in art which could be called decadent in comparison with that of specimens we found in older buildings, and after crossing bridges under the glacial sheet. Small fashion, I've died. Yeah, that's very on brand. Need to blow my nose. Hold on. Okay, I'm gonna make sourdough. Okay, make some good sourdough then. Good luck. Congratulations to flying fisherman for winning the battle royale. Let's see. All right, one edifice hewn from the solid rock seemed to go back 40 or possibly even 50 million years to the lower Eocene or Upper Cretaceous, and contained bas reliefs of an artistry surpassing anything else, with one tremendous exception that we encountered. That was, we have since agreed, the oldest domestic structure we traversed. Isabel is a killer. Yeah, I would not anger Isabel. I feel that's on brand. That she beat up everyone. Were it not for the supporting of those flashlights soon to be made public, I would refrain from telling what I found and inferred, lest I be confirmed as a madman. However, the infinitely early parts of the patchwork tale representing the pre-terrestrial life of the star-headed beings on other planets, in other galaxies, and other universes can readily be interpreted as the fantastic mythology of those beings themselves. Yet such parts can sometimes involve designs and diagrams so uncannily close to the latest findings of mathematics and astrophysics that I scarcely know what to think. Let others judge when they see the photographs I shall publish. Naturally, no one set of carving which we encountered told more than a fraction of any connected story. Nor did we begin to come upon the various stages of that story in their proper order. Some of the vast rooms were independent units so far as their designs were concerned, while in other cases a continuous chronicle would be carried through a series of rooms and corridors. The best of the maps and diagrams were on the walls of a frightful abyss below even the ancient ground level, a cavern perhaps 200 feet square and 60 feet high, which had undoubtedly been an educational center of some sort. There are many provoking repetition of the same material, different rooms and buildings, certain chapters of experience, and certain summaries or phases of racial history had evidently been favorites with different decorators or dwellers. Sometimes, though, variant versions of the same theme proved useful in settling debatable points and filling up gaps. I still wonder that we deduced so much in short time at our disposal, Of course, we even now have only the barest outline, and much of it we obtained later on from the study of the photographs and sketches we made. It may be the effect of this later study, the revived memories and vague impressions, acting in conjunction with his general sensitiveness, and with that final supposed horror glimpse, whose essence he will not reveal even to me, which has been the immediate source of Danforth's present breakdown. But it had to be, for we would not issue our warning intelligently without the fullest possible information, and the issuance of that warning is a prime necessity. Certain lingering influences in the unknown Antarctic world of disordered time and alien natural law make it imperative that further exploration be discouraged. The full story, so far as deciphered, will eventually appear in an official bulletin of Miskatonic University. Hence, here I shall sketch only the salient highlights in a formless, rambling way. Myth or otherwise, the sculptures told of the coming of those star-headed things to be nascent, lifeless Earth out of cosmic space. Their coming and the coming of many other alien entities, such as at certain times embark upon spatial pioneering. They seemed able to traverse the interstellar, either on their vast membranous wings, thus oddly confirming some curious hill folklore long ago told me by an antiquarian colleague. They had lived in the sea a good deal, building fantastic cities and fighting terrific battles with nameless adversaries by means of intricate devices employing unknown principles of energy. Evidently, their scientific and mechanical knowledge far surpassed man's today, though they made use of its more widespread and elaborate forms only when obliged to. Some of the sculptures suggested they had passed through a stage of mechanized life on other planets, but had receded upon finding its effects emotionally unsatisfying. The preternatural toughness of organization and simplicity of natural wants made them peculiarly able to live on a high plane without the more specialized fruits of artificial manufacture, and even without garments except for occasional protection against the elements. It was under the sea, at first for food and later for other purposes, that they first created life, using available substances according to long-known methods. The more elaborate experiments came after the annihilation of various cosmic enemies. They had done the same thing on other planets, having manufactured not only necessary foods, but certain multicellular protoplasmic masses capable of molding their tissue into all sorts of temporary organs under hypnotic influence and thereby forming ideal slaves to perform the heavy work of the community. These vicious masses were without doubt what Abdul al-Hazred whispered about as the Shoggoths in his frightful Necronomicon, though even that mad Arab had not hinted that any existed on Earth except in the dreams of those who had chewed a certain alkaloidal herb. The star-headed old ones on this planet had synthesized their simple food forms and bred a good supply of Shoggoths. They allowed other cell groups to develop in other forms of animal and vegetable life for sundry purposes, extirpating any whose presence became troublesome. With the aid of the Shoggoths, whose expansion could be made to lift prodigious weights, small low cities in the sea grew to vast imposing labyrinths of stone, not unlike those which later rose on land. Indeed, the highly adaptable old ones had lived much on land in other parts of the universe, and probably retained many traditions of land construction. As we study the architecture of all those sculpted Pelagian cities, including that whose aeon-dead corridors were even then traversing, we were impressed by a curious coincidence which we have not yet tried to explain even to ourselves. The tops of the building, which in the actual city around us had of course been withered into shapeless ruins ages ago, were clearly displayed in the bas-reliefs and showed vast clusters of needle-like spires, indicating finials on certain cone and pyramid apexes, and tiers of thin horizontal scalloped discs capping cylindrical shafts. This was exactly what we had seen in that monstrous portentous mirage, casting by a dead city whose once such skyline feature had been absent for thousands and tens of thousands of years, which loomed on our ignorant eyes across the unfathomed mountains of madness as we first approached poor Lake's ill-fated camp. Of the life of the Old Ones, both under the sea and after part of them migrated to land, volumes could be written. Those in shallow water had continued the fullest use of the eyes at the end of their 5 main head tentacles, and had practiced the arts of sculpting and of writing in quite the usual way, the writing accomplished with a stylus and on waterproof waxen surfaces. Those lower down in the ocean depths, though they used a curious phosphorescent organism to furnish light, pieced out their vision with obscure special lenses operating through the prismatic cilia on their heads, senses which rendered all the Old Ones partially independent of light in emergencies. Their forms of sculpture and writing had changed curiously during the descent, embodying certain apparent chemical coating processes, probably to secure phosphorescence, which the bas reliefs could not make clear to us. The beings moved in the sea partly by swimming, using the lateral crinoid arms, and partly by wriggling with the lower tier of tentacles, containing the pseudofeet. Occasionally they accomplished long swoops with the auxiliary use of 2 or more sets of their fan-like folding wings. On land, they locally used the pseudofeet, but now and then flew to great heights over long distances with their wings. The many slender tentacles into which the crinoid arms branched were infinitely delicate, flexible, strong, and accurate in muscular nervous coordination, ensuring the utmost skill and dexterity in all artistic and other manual operations. The toughness of the things was almost incredible. Even the terrific pressure of the deepest sea bottoms appeared powerless to harm them. Very few seemed to die at all except by violence, and their burial places were very limited. The fact that they had covered their virtually inhumed dead with 5-pointed inscribed mounds set up thoughts in Danforth and me which made a fresh pause and recuperation necessary after the sculptures revealed it. The beings multiplied by means of spores, like vegetables Therodoptia, as Lake had suspected, but, owing to their prodigious toughness and longevity, and consequent lack of replacement needs, they did not encourage the large-scale development of new Prophalia, except when they had new regions to colonize. The young matured swiftly and received an education evidently beyond any standard we can imagine. The prevailing intellectual and aesthetic life was highly evolved, and produced a tenaciously enduring set of customs and institutions which I shall describe more fully in my coming monograph. These varied slightly according to sea or land residence, but it had the same foundations and essentials. Though able, like vegetables, to derive nourishment from inorganic substances, they vastly preferred organic and especially animal food. They ate uncooked marine life under the sea, but cooked their viands on land. They hunted game and raised meat herds, slaughtering with sharp weapons whose odd marks on certain fossil bones our expedition had noted. They resisted all ordinary temperatures marvelously, and in their natural state could live in water down to freezing. When the great chill of the Pleistocene drew on, however, nearly 1 million years ago, the land dwellers had to resort to special measures, including artificial heating, until at last the deadly cold appears to have driven them back into the sea. For their prehistoric flights through cosmic space, legend said, they had absorbed certain chemicals and became almost independent of eating, breathing, and other or heat conditions. By the time of the Great Cold, they had long lost track of the method. In any case, they could not have prolonged the artificial state indefinitely without harm. Being non-pairing and semi-vegetable in structure, the Old Ones had no biological basis for the family phase of mammal life, but seemed to organize large households on the principles of comfortable space utility, and as we deduced from the picture occupations and diversions of cod dwellers. Congenial mental associations. In furnishing their homes, they kept everything in the center of the huge rooms, leaving all wall spaces free for decorative treatment. Lighting in the case of the land inhabitants was accomplished by a device probably electrochemical in nature. Both on land and underwater, they used curious tables, chairs, and couches, like cylindrical frames, for they rested and slept upright, with folded-down tentacles, and racks for the hinge sets of dotted surfaces formed their books. Government was evidently complex and probably socialistic, though no certainties in this regard could be deduced from the sculptures we saw. There was extensive commerce, both local and between different cities. Certainly small, flat counters, five-pointed and inscribed, serving as money. Probably the smaller of the various green soapstones found by our expedition were pieces of such currency. Though the culture was mainly urban, some agriculture and much stock raising existed. Mining and a limited amount of manufacturing were also practiced. Travel was very fast, but permanent migration seemed relatively rare, except for the vasting colonizing movements by which the race expanded. For propulsion locomotion, no external aid was used except on land, air, and water movements, like the old ones seemed to possess excessively vast capacities for speeds. Loads, however, driven by beasts of burden, shagos under the sea, and a curiously variety of primitive vertebrates in the later years of land existence. These vertebrates, as well as infinitely other life forms, animals and vegetable, marine, terrestrial, and aerial, were the products of unguided evolution, acting on life cells made by the old ones, but escaping beyond their radius of attention. They had been suffered to develop unchecked because they had not come in conflict with the dominant beings. Bothersome forms, of course, were mechanically exterminated. It interested to see in some of the very last and most decadent sculptures a shambling primitive mammal, used sometimes for food and sometimes as an amusing buffoon by the land dwellers, whose vaguely simian and human foreshadowings were unmistakable. In the building of land cities, the huge stone blocks of the high towers were generally lifted by vast winged pterodactyls of a species hitherto unknown to paleontology. The persistence with which the old ones survived various geological changes and convulsions of the Earth's crust were little short of miraculous. Though few or none of their first cities seemed to have remained beyond the Archaean age, there was no interruption in their civilization or in the transmission of their records. Their original place of advent to the planet was the Antarctic Ocean. It is likely that they came not long after the matter forming. The moon was wrenched from the neighboring South Pacific. According to one of the sculptured maps, the whole globe was then under water, with stone cities scattered farther and farther from the Antarctic as aeons passed. Another map shows a vast bulk of dry land around the South Pole, where it is evident that some of the beings made experimental settlements, that their main centers were transferred to the nearest sea bottom. Later maps, which display these later maps which display this landmass as crackling and drifting, and sending certain detached parts northward, upholding in a striking way the theories of continental drift later advanced by Taylor, Wegener, and Joly. With the upheaval of new land in the South Pacific, tremendous events began. Some of the marine cities were hopelessly shattered, yet that was not the worst misfortune. Another race, a land race of beings shaped like octopi, and probably corresponding to the fabulous pre-human spawn of Cthulhu, soon began filtering down from cosmic infinity, and precipitate a monstrous war for a time to drive the old ones wholly back to the sea, a colossal blow in view of the increasing land settlements. Later, peace was made, and the new lands were given to the Cthulhu spawn, whilst the old ones had held the sea and the older lands. New land cities were founded, the greatest of them in the Antarctic, for this region of first arrival was sacred. From then on, as before, the Antarctic remained the center of the old one civilization, and all the cities built there by the Cthulhu spawn were blotted out. Then, suddenly, the land of the Pacific sank again, taking with them the frightful stone city of Relay and all the cosmic octopi, so that the old ones were again supreme on the planet, except for one shadowy fear about which they did not like to speak. At a rather large age, their cities dotted all the land and water areas of the globe, hence the recommendation in my coming monograph that some archaeologists make systematic borings with Peabod's type of apparatus in certainly widely separated regions. The steady trend down to the ages was from water to land, a movement encouraged by the rise of new land masses. Though the ocean was never wholly deserted, Another cause of the landward movements was the new difficulty in breeding and managing the shoggoths, upon which successful sea life depended. With the march of time, as the sculptures sadly confessed, the art of creating new life from inorganic matter had been lost, so that the old ones had to depend on the molding of forms already in existence. On land, the great reptiles proved highly tractable, but the shoggoths of the sea, reproducing by fission and acquiring a dangerous degree of accidental intelligence, presented for a time a formidable problem. They had always been controlled by the hypnotic suggestions of the old ones, and had modeled their tough plasticity into various useful temporary limbs and organs. But now their self-modeling powers were sometimes exercised independently, and in various imitative forms implanted by past suggestion. They had, it seems, developed a semestible brain whose separate and occasional stubborn volition echoed the will of the old ones without always obeying it. Sculptured images of those shoggoths filled Danforth and me with horror and loathing. They were normally shapeless entities composed of a viscous jelly, which looked like an angulation of bubbles, and each averaged about 15 feet in diameter when a sphere. They had, however, a constantly shifting shape and volume, throwing out temporary developments of forming apparent organs of sight, hearing, and speech in imitation of their masters, either spontaneously or according to suggestion. They seemed to have become peculiarly intractable towards the middle of the Permian Age, perhaps 150 million years ago, when a veritable war of resubjugation was waged upon them by the marine old ones. Pictures of this war and of the headless slime-coated fashion in which the shoggoths typically left their slain victims held a marvelous fearsome quality despite the intervening abyss of untold ages. The old ones had used curious weapons of molecular disturbance against the rebel entities, and the end had achieved a complete victory. Thereafter, the sculptures showed a period in which shoggoths were tamed and broken by armed old ones, as the wild horses of the American West were tamed by cowboys. Through their rebellion, the shoggoths had shown an ability to live out of water. This transition was not encouraged, since their usefulness on land would hardly have been commensurate with the trouble of their management. During the Jurassic Age, the old ones met fresh adversary in the forms of a new invasion from outer space, this time by half fungus, half crustacean creatures, undoubtedly the same as those figuring in certain whispered hill legends of the north, or remembered in the Himalayas as the Migo, or abominable snowmen. To fight these beings, the old ones attempted for the first time since their Terran advent to sally forth again into the planetary ether, but despite all traditional preparations, found it no longer possible to leave the Earth's atmosphere. Whatever the old secret of interstellar travel had been, it was now definitely lost to the race. In the end, the Migo drove the old ones out of the northern lands, though they were powerless to disturb those in the sea. Little by little, the slow retreat of the elder race, the original Antarctic habitat was beginning. Hold on, I want to get okay. Okay, we're gonna call it for right now. Um, but I've enjoyed this, so we'll be finishing this up next week. Um, but I have been enjoying this story time with y'all. Um, and thank you so much for coming by to see. I will see y'all next time. Finish this off.